Joining us now, barrister and writer Chris Daw KC and former police officer and knife crime campaigner Norman Brennan. Afternoon to you both. I mean, we've all spoken together before on these kind of issues, and here we are again, Chris Daw. I mean, you're not a fan of just sending people to jail, I know that, but whatever we're doing at the moment isn't working, Chris.
Well, you say that. Let's get some context, shall we? Knife crime in the past year has actually been 5% lower than it was in the year up until March 2020, when we went into lockdown. So what we're really seeing here is the classic example of an extraordinarily serious and high-profile case, the Nottinghamshire killings, which involved a knife. And somehow or other, that single incident has been blown up into this enormous media firestorm that there's something wrong with the entire policing of knife crime across the country, even though it's lower than it was 3 or 4 years ago. So we have to get real about it. And the truth of it is that in the great majority of knife crime cases, the knives that are used are not zombie knives, but they're knives like this, like the one I have in my kitchen here. Which, of course, is as much a deadly weapon as any zombie knife was going to be if it's in the wrong hands and the wrong place. The truth is, what you have to look at is, why are young people carrying knives? And in many, many cases, it's out of an irrational fear that they themselves are going to be attacked with a knife, and they have no choice but to carry one to defend themselves. And that's an education problem. It's not a criminal justice problem. Well,
indeed. But Norman Brennan, you know, it's a fair point. Look, it's not just zombie knives. That does grab the headlines. I would imagine most of the fatal knife crime offences that take place are probably not with a zombie knife. Something a kid's taken from their mum's kitchen or similar. But nonetheless, it's fair to say, Norman, that despite what Chris says, we still have a big problem. We still have young teens on a week-by-week basis taking the lives of other teens. Average age 15, 16, in that ballpark, and nothing substantially is changing.
You're right. I just want to clear up a point that Chris raised, is that when knife crime, robberies, etc. go up and down, they're normally up and down against historic highs. I think we had 57,000 knife offences committed last year alone. Well, let me tell you how serious the problem is. And I agree with Chris again to a degree that people do carry it for self-defence, but many of them don't. This zombie issue is really a red herring. Do you realise, Ian, it's taken 8 years for the government to define what a zombie knife is? How many hundreds of children do you think have been stabbed to death on the streets of London and Britain? How many thousands of people have been stabbed to death in Britain whilst the government are deciding on what to do? Let me tell you how serious the problem is. 26, 27 years ago, after being a police officer, I was stabbed by an armed burglar. I nearly took my life. I was in full uniform. I realised then that the police were very woefully protected, and that knife crime, not just for police but for the public, was out of control, and it would reach epidemic proportions. So what I did is I broke from the ranks and started doing press interviews. I went to number 10 Downing Street with black families and white families who had lost a loved one through knife crime. And I said that what we need, Mr. Blair, is 5-year mandatory sentences for anyone carrying a knife in a public place without lawful authority or reasonable excuse. And if they were juvenile, 3 years. I predicted the epidemic that was to come. Look at what we're talking about with Chris now. 27 years on. It took 8 years for the government to define what a knife is. They haven't talked about prison sentencing, mandatory sentencing, stop and search, mentors, prison visits, getting police officers into streets, putting hundreds of millions of pounds into community centres. They're talking about something that's not going to cost them any money. So the circle goes round, and guess what the result is? More children will die, more adults will die, and communities will live in fear of those carrying knives on the streets of London and Britain.
And Chris, just on that point that Norman raised, a lot of our viewers and listeners have raised the same point as well. You and I have locked horns on this one. Caught carrying a knife in the street, if you're not a chef or, you know, require it for work, etc., 5 years in jail. What's wrong with that?
Because it doesn't achieve anything except creating a massive number of criminalised teenagers who will just become sophisticated adult criminals. And when they get out in 3 or 4 or 5 years' time, their chances of ever living a law-abiding and non-violent life are next to zero.
With respect, Chris, I mean, sorry to interject, but if you tell a 16-year-old they're going to jail for 5 years, no, serve half your sentence, 5 years, they're not going to want to go through that again, surely.
Well, Ian, you say that as someone who I assume has never represented a 16-year-old in any form of crime. And I have dozens and dozens of them, particularly in my early career, and not one of them had the slightest clue, let alone interest, in what the sentence was at the time that they committed the crime. Those two things are completely disconnected. Young people don't commit crimes because they
never done it. We've never put that out there, Chris. It's not the word on the street at the moment is you can probably get away with this. That's the word for 16-year-olds.
We have had mandatory custodial sentences for 16-year-olds for first-time possession of a knife for the last 5 years or so. And what difference does it make? It makes no difference.
How many 16-year-olds were sent to jail for the first-time offence of carrying a knife? None.
No one goes to prison.
No, that's not true.
It is true, Chris.
Some absolutely have been. But whether they have or not, the point of this, Ian, you either believe that 16-year-olds are sitting around scrolling through news feeds to check out the latest sentence provisions, or you realise that's lunacy and nonsense, and you need to be looking at why are these 16-year-olds carrying knives? Because I tell you what, it's nothing to do with the criminal justice system. It's cultural. It's gang associations. It's violence in their own communities. That's what you have to address.
Norman, it won't work sending people to jail, says Chris.
Who says it won't work? We've never tried it. Let me just tell you, Ian, and Chris will probably know as well, knife homicides outnumber gun homicides by 3 to 1. Yet if you carry a Section 1 firearm in a public place or have it in your possession, it's 5 years imprisonment. Yet if you carry a knife, which is equally lethal, in fact, more lethal in statistics, you're more likely to get a fine, a conditional discharge. And let me just remind Chris as well, I mean, I was a police officer. Some of these 16-year-olds are hardened criminals. There is very few tricks for them to learn when they go to a young offenders institute and then on to prison. I don't want to see children and young men in prison. But what we need to do is send out a strong, determined message. Even Victor Eldras, the actor, only 2 weeks ago, came out with these props outside Parliament, and within 24 hours, there were 7 stabbings in London and a shooting, 2 fatalities, a couple were in my own area. We haven't tried prison, and let me tell you what will happen, is if we started sending children, 15 to 16, 17-year-olds to prison for 3 years minimum, I promise you this, the message will be out that the criminal justice system, for once, is challenging us. We are not able to walk the streets armed with our knives, whether it's to commit crime or defend ourselves. There will be severe action taken. Yes, it will fill the prisons and to overflowing, but today, the only idea that the government have come out with is not investing in our youth, opening youth centres, getting mentors, visiting prisons, getting police officers into schools to try and engage with the youth that are going the wrong way. What it is what is the definition of a zombie knife? There's tens of thousands of zombie knives already on the streets. It's a bit like the horse has bolted and they're now closing the gate. If that's the best that they can offer, London and the streets of Britain are going to continue to be plagued by knife crime, deaths, maimings, stabbings, and communities living in fear. Will someone, for once, listen to someone like me that lives in the real world? I'm surviving today because a knife missed my heart by a centimetre. I care passionately about knife crime. It almost cost me my life. I've stopped and searched young men and seized dozens of knives, probably saved people's lives. It's time that we sent out a strong message. Carry a knife on the streets without lawful authority or reasonable excuse, you will go to prison. You will go to a young offenders institute, and hopefully they will be rehabilitated and told the errors of their way and come out better people.
Okay.
And send a strong message out, Ian, nothing will change.
And Chris, just finally, I mean, you disagree, I know, with that way of doing things, although in fairness to what Norman said, it's never really been tried, not with any meaningful, robust approach. If that isn't the answer, what is the answer?
Well, can I just pay tribute to Norm, because Norm's a friend of mine. We have very strong disagreements, as you and he know, about the criminal justice aspect and the sentencing aspect. But the one thing I will say about Norman is that the things that he points to about drawing attention to this issue and actually getting young people to engage with the dangers of carrying knives, the reality of it. I spent some time with Debbie Mackey, who sadly passed away, and her son Yusuf, of course, was tragically killed as a teenager with knife crime, and subsequently his mother died of a broken heart. That's how much it affected her. And I sat down and talked to her about it. And the reality is, if young people could see the face of a mother who has had her son taken away from her, if they could see the stabbed and broken corpse of a teenager with blood pouring from it as he's left the operating table as a dead body, young people need information. They need the reality of it. At the moment, all we're talking about is one solution: lock them up for years and years. That just never worked. It doesn't work anywhere in the world. It never has. And what we need to do is people like Norman need to get out there, tell his story, show these young people what the consequences are for them, and then there's a slight chance, if we also improve their communities, that things might change.
Norman, we've got 15 seconds. If you can do a response to that, that would be great.
I agree with Chris on that. We cannot have children walking the streets with no hope, no future hope, and feeling that their life or anybody else's life is worthless. Because if that's the attitude of our youth, they don't care. Even if you brought the death sentence back, it won't change them. But we must send a strong message out. We must engage with our youth. They can't be ignored because they're the future.
Thank you, Chris Daw KC and Norman Brennan. It's always a tricky debate. You want to get involved in this, 0344 499 1000.